Welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Brumleve, and today I am happy to welcome in Josh Belk. He is the president over at Trax Tech, and today we are going to be talking about emissions in the transportation space and how we can all make a little bit better of purchasing and buying decisions. So, Josh, welcome into the
Well,
show.
thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Now, for folks who may not be familiar with you and your company, can you kind of give us that high level overview of where the company came from, where you came from, and how you all kind of fit together?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I'll try to keep it brief. But back in 1996, Trax was founded to be a global freight auditor. That means that our primary job has been managing large companies' spend, transportation spend, over across all modes, all regions around the world. And so today we manage approximately $24 billion in transportation spend. And company is private equity held, and I was brought in as part of the leadership team to take it to the next level and grow that business further. But along the way, we've discovered that the same data, or a lot of the same data that we use for auditing and verifying expenses related to transportation, can also be used to verify emissions. And so that's what we're here to talk about today is really how companies, what first of all, why companies should be thinking about emissions and managing their scope 3 emissions for their organizations, and then how they can go about doing it. uh, and Yeah, so that's the background. And today we're 530 people around the world, in all regions, and serving customers in 120 countries.
Wow. So, did you have, did you work in the logistics industry before you joined Trax, or is it kind of a newish, I guess, venture for
I've been
you?
more of a private equity leader than I have been a logistics leader. And so the logistics side has come along over the last few years, maybe the last 7 or 8 years, and certainly the last three here at Trex.
And specifically when it comes, to I guess overall awareness of the industry, it's been interesting to watch over the last few years, especially since what is the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. I think that was the sort of supply chain's like shining moment of getting on more people's radar, and a big component I think of getting onto more people's radar is the supply chain person or the logistics person finally getting a seat at the table within the boardroom, within the meetings. And so people are starting to pay more attention to how much money they actually spend on transportation, which I think is, a good conversation for us to have today, especially as it ties into environmental benefits. But I want to kind of, before we dive in, I want to kind of back up just a little bit from sort of a high level view. Is it possible to have a environmentally friendly transportation company? What does that baseline look
Oh
like?
gosh, that's a great question. To me, that's a company that's investing in options. There's the reality of where we are today. It's not reasonable, I don't think, to expect a transportation company to autonomously create an emissions free solution offering that is, unfortunately, price competitive to the traditional offerings, because we're still developing, we're still optimizing those technologies that are used to cut emissions. But they can create options, and they can partner with their customers to be able to provide better fuel choices, to be able to provide, or start to invest in more robotics, more. I'm a little hesitant on the self-driving, just personally, self-driving tractor trailers that are coming
You're not
on the
alone.
road, right? Like, it just makes me a little nervous, but that's coming. And the more that we invest in that, the more our large transportation leaders. I don't expect Joe's Trucking to do that, right? But some of our larger 4PLs, and global transportation vendors, whether they're in air, whether they're in ocean, whether they're in trucking, certainly rail, have the opportunity to support innovation, and doing so with the partnership of their customer base who's willing to pay for it is all I think we're looking for.
And I think that ties into sort of the Trax mission statement, because in one of the briefings that I was reading through is that, the meshing the cost optimization, carbon emissions management, and reduction all into one platform. And for Trax specifically, you stated in a recent interview that your company has invested $30 million into the world's first transportation spend management platform. This is the course of over a handful of years. Can you break down what a transportation spend management platform is, and who it benefits?
Yeah. So let me reverse that. Uh, our TSM platform benefits anybody who ships large volumes around the world. So companies that use us typically are spending somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million or more in their transportation costs globally.
Wow.
We have some that spend multiple billions of dollars a year in transportation. So these are the companies that you and I have both heard of, and that we trust with our consumer dollar day in, day out. Uh, these companies are increasingly looking beyond what was traditional freight audit, which was just, is the bill correct? To instead want to make sure that the bill's correct. That's table stakes, but then be able to take data out of that billing process and combine it with a lot of other data in the organization to be able to understand better how decisions are being made, how their network is operating, where they're seeing delays or events that are driving costs up, and being able to take action on that. And so, transportation spend management is about broadening from just a traditional freight audit value proposition to being able to truly optimize for cost and for service the transportation network. So
And I think for a lot of folks, they just don't. When you hear numbers like this, like billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on transportation, that, the overall transportation budget is somewhere around like 50%, upwards of 70% of, a manufacturer's cost of getting their goods to the end user, to the end user consumer. And so if you can have, when you're spending hundreds of, millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, a small fraction of a savings on your transportation can mean so much to not only the company that's spending that money, but then also for the consumer. They can get that item at a lower price. Hopefully, some of those savings would be passed
yeah, it
down.
should trickle down a little bit. Today's world, where we keep seeing tens of thousands of people being laid off, I like to think of it as an opportunity to reduce costs and preserve your human capital. That's one of the ways that we think we're adding value to our customers is allowing them to reduce budgets by reducing the cost of transportation and not by losing important human capital that they might have.
Absolutely. And I've heard this comment before that, ESG is the culture of a company, not the task of one person. It's a top down approach. That's another tactical approach in risk management. And so first, could you sort of explain, what I feel like a lot of our audience and just me in general, we've heard the term ESG for a while now, but can you explain what it is and then break down what the different scopes, because there's three different scopes from what I understand. So if you could just broadly define what ESG is and then those three different scopes for us.
Sure. And I appreciate us talking about this because it's I think it's really important to all of us. It's extraordinarily important to me as I'm starting to get to the age where grandchildren are the next step in my personal life, and I really want them to have a wonderful world to live in. And
Absolutely.
so when we think of ESG for large organizations, large enterprise, it really should. I think, I don't know who you quoted there, but I think it's awesome. It really does have to be a cultural shift. It has to be of strategic importance. It's a company that's saying, we understand that for our company to be sustainable in this world, we first need a sustainable world, right? And so we're going to do our part to make sure that we are creating a company that provides returns to shareholders. That's what all companies are trying to do, but also are being good stewards of the environment that we're given. And so when I look at the best companies out there that are doing this well, they are literally creating a culture. It's not just one person who's supposed to be doing ESG reporting to the SEC. That's important, and we'll talk about that in more detail here in a minute. But they're driving down the idea that we're not just here to manage cost. We're not just here to manage service. We're managing sustainability as that third leg of the stool, and it's part of every person's job in the organization. If whether you're creating a product, whether you're managing vendors, whether you're shipping product around the world, we all are making decisions daily on uh, the not just the cost impact, but also the emissions impact to how to what we're deciding. So if you, for example, if you decide, you know what, I really have to have this pallet overseas tomorrow, and I need to go rent a plane, um, or conversely, you know what, I could wait 3 weeks and I could put that on a ship. Well, there's a cost component to that. There's a service component to that, but there's also a huge emissions impact to that. That's air freight is extraordinarily high in carbon emissions. And so that takes us to, so how do people manage emissions, and what are these scopes that everybody talks about? So that you're right, there's three scopes: scope one, scope two, scope three. Scope one are the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions that are created by building your product, by manufacturing your product. Think of it as the direct emissions coming from your factories, your plants, and so on. Scope two is your indirect emissions. So that is you run certain processes within your plant. Those consume electricity. Well, that electricity was created somehow. Was it by wind or solar? Great. Then there wouldn't be any emissions. But if it's by coal or natural gas or some other form of fuel generating that electricity, then there's emissions related to that. So scope one is direct, scope two is sort of indirect, and then scope three or are emissions that are outside of your direct control. They're your third parties that are providing you service, but that you need to get your product to market or to run your business, and as a result, you incur emissions costs. Your business is responsible for those emissions. So, as an example, if you're putting a pallet on a truck or you're putting a container on a ship, the portion of that vehicle's emissions movement that's tied to your particular product is your responsibility from a scope three standpoint. And so those are
And so
the three scopes.
I guess maybe a good example of this would be like Apple, for example, with manufacturing the iPhone is your scope one, and then the scope two is the energy that it took to produce that iPhone, and then scope three is the transportation of that iPhone to the end user consumer. Is that a
Yeah.
perfect? Okay, good. Now that I kind of have a good grasp of what all, because it sounds like, scope one and scope two can really have a higher impact if the company cares enough. And then scope three is really making your vendors care about
Yeah,
it.
you're right. Scope one and two are sort of within my control, right? And that's where most ESG programs are pretty well versed. They've been studying this for a few years now. They've got their arms around it in most cases, not all, but most cases. And so they're in a good position to be able to report on those. Scope three, you're absolutely right. You're dependent upon all your wide variety of vendors. So I get on a plane. I happen to be a huge Delta fan, being here in Atlanta, and so I get on a plane and I go over to our office in the Philippines. Uh, my personal move on that plane is responsible for a certain amount of emissions, right? And if I'm trying to calculate that for part of my scope three reporting, I need to understand, well, how much did that plane incur, depending on whether it was a 747, a 777, A320, whatever the type of aircraft it is, type of fuel it burns, where it went, and the route it took. all of those things shape how much the impact of me going to the Philippines created in terms of an emissions value. Uh, and so when we think of large enterprise, they might have hundreds or thousands of transportation vendors out there, carriers, right, that are moving across planes, trains, and automobiles, all these different moves. And and if they really want to measure scope three, they need to get good data, consistent data from all of those vendors, or have some other way of calculating it to be able to get an accurate value.
So it's not just, I guess, reporting on or data collection on the company level with, at the with different products, but it's or services, but it's also being calculated at the employee level too. So are you seeing, maybe this is anecdotal, but maybe are you seeing where employees are starting to be asked, what options maybe you had for that flight versus the option that you took? Is that being factored into?
I don't see that happening culturally in very many cases because while I use it as an example, I was just trying to give an anecdote because
Sure.
it's a relatively small impact from an emissions standpoint if I go to the Philippines compared to if I move. I won't use Apple's name, but millions of electronic devices around the world. Then how do I measure that? And that's what's really changed. So last year, the SEC announced their intention to create new rules that require all public companies of a certain size, and it's just about everybody uh, who ships a reasonable amount, to start reporting on their emissions, scope one, scope two, and scope three, as part of their financial reporting. So now CEOs and CFOs are going to, when they sign on my submissions for my quarterly reports, they're going to need to be, or maybe annual initially, but they'll need to be validating their emissions volumes as well. And that goes into effect in 2025 for the 2024 year. So as of Jan 1, 2024, every public company on the planet, every public company in the US stock exchange, NASDAQ, will need to be able to measure scope one, scope two, and scope three emissions and be able to report on those in their financial filings, which is great from an investor standpoint. We can invest in companies we believe are taking care of the world, and we can vote with our consumer dollar. But it's a much higher level of reporting and transparency that the SEC is creating.
And I think too that one of the and that same story briefing that I had mentioned earlier, that one of the missions from Trax is really highlighting the importance of carriers working with shippers to help reduce those scope 3 emissions, since tracking greenhouse gases as well as evidence of setting and meeting reduction goals are soon going to be included in those SEC climate reports. So how does going back to the transportation spend management platform, is that how you're tracking all of these different scopes and then within the transportation spend management platform?
Yeah, so I understand your confusion because it's not about spend anymore, right? It's transportation spend and emissions management platform, but that's a really big word or big phrase. So
The acronym doesn't exactly flow off the tongue.
So in October of last year, we released Carbon Emissions Manager, which is a product within our suite that we developed in partnership with AbbVie, the large pharmaceutical company, to be able to calculate and measure carbon emissions across all modes, all carriers, all regions, all countries. Every single place you send you have a shipment, you have a move, we're able to collect that data coming as a result of the invoice that carrier is going to submit to you. And then we use data that we collect and data that's coming from the carrier to be able to then create a consistent method of calculating carbon emissions for all of your transportation. And so, carbon emissions manager to me is just a really important part of the overall, certainly value proposition for Trax, but more importantly, the overall spectrum for these large corporations who all of a sudden need solutions to being able to meet their SEC requirements.
And so when we talk about those new SEC requirements and comparing it to the transportation industry where historically a lot of these bigger companies, even the different modes of transportation, they like to keep their data and their operations within a silo. So how do you sort of encourage these companies? Is it really just the selling point of, hey, this is going to be required from you from the government in order to make this happen? Is there more incentive for them to optimize their operations outside of the environmentally friendly? Is there a cost savings, or is it really just about doing the right thing for a lot of these companies?
For the carriers or for the shippers for the
Well, I would imagine it would impact both decisions, that the shippers would want to pick carriers that are prioritizing that, and then vice
Yeah,
versa.
from a carrier standpoint, we see a lot of good participation in trying to measure and manage at the very large carrier, or I'm using carrier pretty generically, but LSP level, where but we'll go back to Joe's Trucking. Probably doesn't make sense to expect Joe's Trucking to be able to understand exactly what the greenhouse gas emissions coefficients are of his particular trucks. Uh, when he's got five sitting in the right, he's worried about getting his loads from A to Z. He's not trying to optimize his emissions footprint. What the approach we've taken with our customers is let's not push that down to all of your carriers. Let's not push the responsibility of reporting consistently. There's a standard that the world has more or less adopted, EN 16258. It's a European standard that tells us how to calculate carbon emissions across all different types of modes. We've used that to be able to then take data that Joe's Trucking would submit to us, uh, mileage and address to and from addresses and type of truck and type of fuel. All of those kinds of data points come in via the invoice they're already submitting, right? So if we just say, you know what, Joe's Trucking, just submit us your invoice. We'll then do the work of extracting the data, combining it with some additional environmental data and data that we have in terms of mileage and distance and some of these things, and then bring that together, use that to following the European standard to calculate the emissions for that particular move. That means that we don't have to put that burden on each individual carrier. It also means that if there are differences in how carriers calculate things, that doesn't mess up it doesn't mess with the standard that company or that corporation is trying to implement, right? Because if you've got 200 carriers and they all calculate emissions differently, how do you roll that up into one number for the SEC and
Right.
feel good about it? Instead, let's collect data. Let's do the calculations ourselves in a consistent manner, and then use that as the basis for our SEC reporting.
And so I would imagine that it would still, because I come back to this other company that I'm aware of, called Freightvana, where they plant a tree for every load that they ship. Now they're not the largest company in the world; they're growing super fast, but they're not the largest company in the world. And so for them, that is now having a business impact because shippers are seeking them out because of that goal. So I imagine that even though some of these smaller carriers, something like 90% of all carriers within this country have, 7 trucks or
Right.
fewer. So I imagine if maybe the awareness around some of these different environmental goals are made public and the awareness is greater, then some of these smaller carriers could also compete and win the business of some of these shippers, I would
I love that
imagine.
example. I didn't know about that example. I'm going to check them out. But
Well, yeah, because now they're getting shippers coming to them because they know that it's they want to be more environmentally friendly. Their customers want to be environmentally friendly. So now they're seeking out transportation
That's
partners, and they sought them out because of that goal. So I think that there's some lessons maybe that carriers can take, some of those smaller mom and pop ones. They want to earn some of that additional business because of those
yeah.
goals. Is my thought
No, I think
process.
I think that's brilliant, and you're totally right. I, one of the benefits of being able to deploy a solution like ours is creating that transparency for. Uh, so let's say you're a big company, you've got thousands of products, you have different product managers and different transportation managers for each of those products. Just because your CEO needs to say, "Here's my total emissions," doesn't mean that you know what your individual product emissions are and how your transportation decisions impact that. But if we calculate emissions at the individual move level, and then we allocate those emissions just like you would allocate transportation costs down across throughout an organization as sort of a P&L owner, if I'm now using what we call carbon accounting to be able to assign individual product owners carbon emissions to, so that when they start thinking about, okay, my boss has given me a goal, right, of reducing my carbon footprint by 20% for my product category. I can now, as a procurement person, go and meet with my carriers, go look at other vendors like not Carvana.
Oh, Freightvana.
I got to write it down. But I can go look for those options, and 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 because I have a baseline, and because I'm calculating my emissions on a monthly basis based on all my moves, I can then see it trend down. I can see that I'm actually, as I implement Freightvon, I give them some of my loads, and I can see that carbon footprint is lighter. It should go in. That should go into my reporting. I can see that I'm making progress, and I might at some point have to make a decision about, do I take a little bit higher cost so that I can get a little bit lower emissions. But what we see most often right now is that companies are trending towards decisions that lower cost and lower emissions. So better packaging is an example of that. Because if I'm shipping less air, I'm getting better density. I'm reducing my overall shipping cost, but I'm also able to reduce, if I can consolidate loads, I can get from 2 trucks to one or 5 trucks to four. My emissions goes down too.
And so that I think brings up, I guess, the next question is, if you have the platform that has these benchmarks, and then you're educating your audience and your customers about these different goals that you can achieve if you use the different scopes, and you focus on scope 3. But once you've done that hard work of maybe asking your vendors what their emissions reporting process is like, how do you make sure that they continue? Because that's another problem that I hear with apparently, like, scope 3 is that you can do all the due diligence and you can get these vendors to sort of buy in and into your environmentally friendly plan, but how do you make sure that they stay there?
I think that's a wallet share game. Uh, right. I mean, you can do things contractually as a large. Remember, my customers tend to be very large shippers, so they have a lot of buying power, and so they can require commitments like that commercially. But to your point earlier, if their partners aren't making improvements and demonstrating how they're helping that enterprise manufacturer reduce their overall footprint, their emissions footprint, they're going to choose to move those dollars elsewhere. They're going to choose a different carrier that is willing to make those decisions. So I do think that it is incumbent upon the enterprise manufacturer. When I say shipper, that's what I'm referring to, right? Is the enterprise manufacturer to really be the driver, the advocate of emissions, because in the free market, the vendors are going to do what their customers ask. And so what we try to do is we try to meet with all of our large customers, and thankfully, most of them are ahead of us. To be honest, and customers that I've talked to, many of them have had a strong commitment to strong ESG programs and a commitment to reducing their overall emissions footprint. Where they've started is traditionally in scope one, and then maybe they've done a little bit of work in scope two. Where they've had a lot of trouble is in scope three because of the complexity of collecting that data and not having a consistent way to really measure it. And so when we engage with our product now, suddenly they have a solution to do that, and so we're seeing some really great gains, or actually great losses in emissions volumes, great progress as a result of that.
And that's interesting that you say that, because I would almost imagine that some of these business owners are like, oh, another thing that I have to do. Like, is this really going to have like a business impact? But it with the Trax technology, and it sounds like what they can do is not only manage the spend, but then have something that they can kind of market to with their partners and their vendors, and then not just save money in the process, but do something that's better for all parties involved, including future
That's right.
generations. And it's encouraging just to know that they care about it sooner than maybe they might be able to track
That's
it.
right. Yeah, no, we have customers who are now using the data that we provide and the dashboards in the product to bring their vendors in and share with them. Look, you're operating at this level. Your friend over here is operating at this level. Your competitor, here's how you stack rank. What are you going to do to drive emissions down so that I can afford to give you more? I can justify giving you more business, and they're allowing sort of that free market of competition to drive innovation in transportation efficiency, and that's, I think we all win in that regard.
What are some of those data points that I can log in and I can see, how I compare to a competitor, or compare to, a similar company? Is it broken down by like fuel or, packaging costs, or what are some of those data points that you're collecting and reporting
Yeah,
on?
so in emissions, we measure well to wheel and tank to wheel. And these are ways to measure both carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, more generally. And simply, tank to wheel is the emissions created by that vehicle as it moves. So, just specifically, like if I get in my car and I drive 50 miles and I know what kind of engine it is and I know what kind of gas it takes and I know something about the weather that I'm in, I can pretty accurately calculate the emissions cost of that vehicle, right? The weight of the vehicle and so on. So tank to wheel is pretty simple. Well to wheel takes into account the emissions that were created by in the creation of the fuel. So I'll give you two quick examples. In a traditional vehicle using unleaded gas, you've got the cost in tank to wheel is just whatever gas I spent and the amount of emissions that came from that. But my well to wheel calculation also has to take into account the emissions that were generated by creating that gas that I pumped into my car, right? Um, it's more complicated than that, but some
Oh, I'm
high
sure.
level, that's what we're talking about. In an electric vehicle, tank to wheel, there's no emissions, right? It's not burning anything. There's no fuel being consumed. It's an electric car. Tesla would like us to just stop right there in our conversation. However, to create that battery, to charge that battery, consumes electricity. That electricity is being generated somehow. Now, if it's being generated by windmills, all the better, or water, or solar. But a lot of it isn't, right? A lot of our grid is powered by other types of generation, and those types of generation have emissions. And so when you look at well to wheel, those emissions are for an electric vehicle aren't zero. They're something else. There's real emissions that that vehicle is responsible for. And so when we do carbon emissions reporting for our customers, we're reporting on both well to wheel and tank to wheel, both for carbon alone and for the broader set of greenhouse gases that get created. And that's how companies are benchmarking, reporting to the SEC, but also then benchmarking their individual vendors so that they can show their vendors, look, here's the amount of emissions that the tonnage of carbon that came from moving our product with your vehicles. Here's the tonnage of carbon that came from moving our product with that guy's vehicles, right? And his are performing better. So I need you to make improvements in your emissions efficiency.
And then from I guess from a consumer standpoint, I would imagine because my first inclination is for a lot of these companies, they're obviously very, we live in a capitalist country, people just, they want to maximize profits. So what do these companies care, about, sort of ESG goals? But then on the consumer side of things, they are becoming more aware of the environmental impact. They are more concerned, with the future generations and being able to leave the planet like not a disaster. And so that in turn makes the companies care because the consumers are going to start making those buying decisions. Are you seeing, sort of anecdotally, are you seeing any kind of, manufacturers or just brands in general that are sort of adopting that transparency when it comes to their own ESG rating so the consumer can make the better buying decision, and then thus these companies who are largely responsible for a lot of these emissions responsible for lowering their own? I think that's a really roundabout way of getting to how do we make these companies start abiding by these rules that should be for instilled for future
So
generations.
I'd say it's been building, but over the last 6 months, it's becoming a boardroom conversation at just about every large company in the country, and it's because of what you just said that it's not just the right thing to do. It is going to impact their top and bottom lines if they can't, particularly for consumer facing brands. So we all know what consumer facing brands are. Anything we would go buy. But um, the more consumers care about this, and the groundswell is significant already and increasing, the more these companies are realizing we're going to lose sales because consumers want a product that they believe has been sourced, produced sustainably, and that is driving real behavior change in starting at the board level on down.
And so whenever I guess these conversations are happening in the boardroom, maybe it's that sweet spot between they realize it's a problem, they realize they need to develop a solution, and then the end goal for you, of course, is for somebody to become a customer of Trax. What does that middle ground look like? What are some easy ways to get started with ESG goals that then leads into investing in a transportation spend management platform?
Yeah, that's a marvelous question. If it were me, I'd start to build my organization first. I'd create, I would create a head of ESG, but the best companies have that head, but then appoint leaders within each business function to participate. And usually, and that's how you build a culture, right? You build. It's not just this thing that sits over here. It's ingrained in everything that you do because you have somebody who's part of their job in each function is to carry the flag for ESG goals. And AbbVie, as an example, is a great example of that. They have a formal ESG program. They have a formal ESG governance organization. But then within all parts of their supply chain organization, they have people assigned who have raised their hand. They've stepped forward. It's not a burden. They're saying, look, I'm passionate about this. I want to participate. And then there's a tremendous amount of communication that surrounds what they're doing, how they're doing it, why it's good for both AbbVie and their customers in the world, and so they make a really serious commitment to it being part of their overall corporate culture. And until you do that, you can put in a solution like mine, and we'll give you good reporting, but I have less confidence that you'll actually see that number trend downwards. Trending down is a collaboration between my tools and capabilities and then my customers' commitment to use that to make decisions, business decisions to drive down emissions.
Yeah, I think that that's really well said because and unless it's done at the cultural level within the company, then it doesn't make much sense for you to spend money on a program when you're not quite ready for that yet. But then if you do take those extra steps, and then it makes a whole lot more sense that you're doing good, not just by the company standpoint, but by your customers, and then overall, future generations. All right. Well, I think that about does it for all of the questions that I had. Did you have any more questions, or not questions, but was there any questions that I should have asked that I didn't ask?
Oh gosh, I don't know what comes next in emissions. That wasn't one that I prepared for. Uh, what comes next is something that we sometimes talk about. We're seeing a lot more investment in green fuel technology in a variety of different applications, whether it's automobiles, boats, or ships, or trucks. Uh, we're seeing a lot of interest in rail as a way to reduce emissions overall, and sort of you start to think more about when you start to build your network strategy around not just cost and service, but also emissions and that third leg of the stool. We start planning our networks differently. And so what we're seeing is the companies that are taking this seriously are thinking more about, okay, where's my next distribution center, not just based on cost and service, but on the impact of the globe. How is this going to help me reduce my carbon emissions footprint? Uh, and they may design some of their transportation network around that concept. And so we're seeing more innovation in that space as well, which is neat. It's fun to watch because I think there's a lot of oars in the water rowing in the right direction. Uh, Other than that, no, I think I'd leave you with, we'd love to chat with anybody who's interested, and they can learn more at www.traxtech.com, Traxtech.
You took the next question right out of my mouth. So that's a great way to end the show, and we'll make sure that we put all of those links in the show notes to make it easy for folks to check out more about how they can start developing these standards, and when they are ready after they've developed the standards from both a company level and a cultural level, then it'll probably be a good fit for them to partner with a company like Trax. So Josh, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and explaining what all of these, I guess, sort of newfangled ideas and concepts, or not really new, but just a better way to track them is probably a better way to put it.
Blythe, thanks for the time. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Likewise.